Oh dear. Hey guys, and welcome to the Coffee and Coding Podcast, the show where we discuss everything there is to know about app development. I'm your host Rob J, and in today's episode, I chat with digital nomad and longtime developer Mike Akakpo about being a digital nomad in the app development world, generating passive income, his time freelancing for Google, and living the 4-hour workweek lifestyle. So with that intro out of the way, fun fact about this episode. So this was recorded on a Sunday at 2 p.m. I'd gone out for a walk earlier, about 11:30, something like that, with the intention that there'd be plenty of time for me to get back and I'd be back able to set up for this interview. And it got to probably about 20 past 1 and I'm looking at my watch and I'm thinking, well, let's be honest, I was looking at my phone and I'm thinking, yeah, I'm going to make it. 25 past, I'm going to make it. Half an hour, I'm going to make it. And then at about 20 to 2, I checked on Google Maps and it said I was a 37-minute walk away from my house. So I literally ran from where I was all the way home. It took me about 15 minutes. I think I got home at 1:57. I rushed to get a drink. I rushed to get my laptop set up. I rushed to get my microphone set up. And I managed to dial in just as Mike joined the call at 2 p.m. And then I spent the first 10 minutes of the interview trying to catch my breath and not give away the fact that I was absolutely finished. I was out of breath. I was sweating because it was so hot that day. I was a bit of a mess. So, that happened. That doesn't happen every day. And then another fun fact about this episode is probably about the 20-minute mark, give or take, you'll hear, if you listen really closely, my doorbell ring. So when this happened at the time, I heard the doorbell ring. I don't think Mike heard the doorbell ring. And I didn't want to interrupt Mike in the middle of a thought. So I'm patiently waiting for him to finish his thought. And when he's finished, which is about maybe a minute and 30 seconds after the doorbell had rung, I paused the interview to go and answer the door. Obviously, a minute and 30 seconds later, there's no one at the door. And then it turns out that it was actually my partner coming back from the walk with the dog because I had run off and left her walking the dog. And I had the key, so she couldn't get into the house. I didn't know that. I went out after the interview was finished to go and find her because she hadn't come back yet. And she was outside, laying on the grass with the dog, reading Harry Potter. So that's 2 behind-the-scenes tidbits for you. And with that said, let's move on to the show. Here's the interview with Mike. Whereabouts are you now?
Currently in the UK, which is actually quite rare for me. But I think I've been here just before all the pandemic stuff started. So I've been chilling in the UK for a couple of months. I think next stop would have been Tbilisi. So like in Georgia, nearest Turkey. But we'll see. With lockdown and everything else and people either opening or closing their borders, we'll see how that goes.
So normally you travel for work a lot, or do you just pick where you want to be?
Yeah, so typically I think it's fueled by the desire to travel more so than the project. So being a digital nomad, so the idea was there's a desire to travel. A lot of people typically have either one of two problems. They've either got the time because maybe they're not working at present, or they've got the money, but then don't have the time because they're probably busy running a company or something. So the idea is to kind of create this passive, mainly emphasis on passive income, so that you can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You'd have income coming in, but you'd still be able to sustain some sort of lifestyle. So that's kind of pretty much what I did. I transitioned initially from being a permie and more corporate, the corporate setting, to doing more of similar stuff, but then building a whole business around it. And that's where I think the term solopreneur comes from, because it's not really about the scale and running a company of like 40 developers, for instance, more just enough of a lifestyle business or lifestyle design, as they term it, and just having that fuel your projects, basically. So I take advantage of both maybe a country or a location that I wanted to visit anyway, and hoping that if it's actually a project that I wanted to work on, then that's a double whammy.
So you regularly take freelance gigs depending on where you want to be?
Yeah. So I think initially I kind of did go a bit crazy with the traveling. So I ended up pretty much everywhere. But then it got to a point where I was able to actually make the choice purely based off the desire of the project, not just the location. I think I had a few instances of that. I can't remember. It was one particularly, I think it might be the Olympics, last Olympics in Rio. And I pretty much finished up a project anyway. I was chilling, getting ready to do, summer and stuff. And then I get a call out of the blue from a recruiter around lunchtime. And I think within the 12 hours, it was a random Friday. I was ready to go out. I think I was in London, ready to go out with my friends. And then this recruiter comes and like calls me at lunchtime. I was like, okay, cool. And apparently they've got an urgent requirement for a developer out in, like, I think it was Barcelona at the time. And literally within 12 hours, I was in Barcelona, like ready to jump on this project, like ready to go. So yeah, and I've had a few crazy instances like that. And I think the idea of having it be so free in the term freelance, it makes it a lot easier to pick and choose what's suitable for me, both in terms of availability and just interest in the general project. And then that's kind of what I've done for the last, I think, 5 years or so.
So before that, you were permie, right?
Yeah, so I was pretty much straight out of uni and into, I think, my first perm role, which was more ethnography and research, and then a little bit more of a development take. But I think the emphasis of development was a lot less in my earlier days. And then I slowly transitioned more into full-on, just pure developer roles.
So I want to get into what ethnography is, because I'll be honest, that's the first time I ever heard the term, so I'm super interested. But I was going to say, before we get there, so you transitioned from permie to what you do now, and then in between, were you freelance based, in London, or were you straight away freelance wherever you want to be?
So I think, generally speaking, a lot of digital nomads, I think they take the full-on leap of like, they'll go from wherever they are at, whether it's UK or US, and then boom, end up in like Thailand or like Bali somewhere. So I couldn't make that such a rash jump. So what I did was I think I'd done about a good year and a half in a small startup initially, and this was like less than 5 people, I think, at their best as far as numbers. So I was mainly, I think everything that I did was literally most of the income generating activity. So just one dev managing an existing project that was built by a whole different team that they outsourced initially before I got there. So I did that for a bit for a couple of airlines. It was a really unique development experience as far as being my first, but also one of my many sole developer roles that I ended up having. So I did that for a bit, transitioned more into, then after another 18 months, into a big corporate where I was literally just a number. Like, I could go missing, no one would notice, kind of thing. So I think once I got that out of my system, I was in London at the time as well, and I felt, okay, I want to try something different. So I kind of came across this book called The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss. It tells you a massive dream on, like digital nomadism and how you'll be traveling left, right, and center. And to be fair, it has come to fruition. Once I got the book and decided to implement what it was I'd learned, I decided, well, first things first, kind of transition slowly so it's not so uncomfortable. I was used to a steady paycheck, so now going from that to pricing jobs, and then you can have up and down times as far as the stream. So that was probably my hardest thing to resist. So once I kind of made peace with that, I said, all right, cool. Luckily my transition was pretty straightforward, because it was about not the skill set that I had already honed over the last 3 years. Development was pretty much going to stay the same. It was just understanding the business around what it now means to be an entity of one, or a business of one, or a company of one. So that was my learning curve. The actual development, it actually allowed me to see multiple code bases and realize some consistencies and inconsistencies between different companies and projects, which I think would have not been something I would have seen had I been, say, in one place in particular for an extended period of time, for example. So I think my first gig, I might have leveraged an existing relationship with one of my earlier companies. So this was with one of the bigger OEM manufacturers, and then they had this specific unique project that I wanted to get involved in. It was to do with teaching kids how to write code, but in a more playful fashion than we're particularly used to. So they invented this microbit that they would use. It's basically like a PCB, and you could just connect it to your phone, and then you can create any app, or at least any basic app, just to kind of teach you the fundamentals of coding. So that was pretty much my first project. I stayed there for a bit, got extended. And then after doing that, I was like, okay, now what? So I started looking at, how do I market myself? How do I get my skill set in front of people? And then lo and behold, I think that same year, I think shortly after that, that's when I kind of started working with some cosmetic companies, and then got called out eventually for, I believe it was the Olympics that year. So the Rio Olympics that year. And that's kind of how that went.
So question is, did you actually finish the 4-hour work week? Because I've tried to read it 3 times and I get about a third of the way through and I get so hyped up that I just can't finish it and I just go and do something.
Yeah, I think I was lucky to, it was one of the few books back then that I would take from start and literally finish. Because I know there's a part where you get near to the end and he just starts listing a ton of links and you're like, okay, cool, gotta check that out. So I can remember that bit. For most people, it's like, okay, once you got to that point, you're like, wow, okay, what now? Like, it's so, I think for me, luckily enough, I did finish the book. I read it multiple times and I still pick it up every now and again. I think the initial part for me was, I think my desire at the time to be that free was so strong. So it felt like the classic or cliched life-changing experience of reading the book, actually putting it to fruition and having that pretty much set the pace for everything that was going to come next. I mean, I'd read a few books, maybe not in that arena book. It was pretty straightforward. It was just like you set up a business and there's multiple ways to do it. You could either become remote first and then kind of pull away from the traditional permie role. So there was multiple ideas inside the book. And I think I was just lucky that I didn't have to go into a whole new arena beforehand. So if I was like, I don't know, if I was trying to now do graphic design all of a sudden or marketing coming from development, that challenge might have put me off a bit. But because it was already development and I just happened to pick something that made itself quite, I guess, versatile in this manner, it was pretty straightforward to, I guess, navigate into freelancing and then work on passive income sources around that to kind of tie up the loose ends. Because you could get gaps of time where you're like, what am I supposed to do now? So I think my next original, I guess, natural progression to that was to make projects for myself to kind of eat up the time, but also just, I guess, sharpen my sword and just keep in the game, really. Because it's so weird where you can move from one place to another and then realize, okay, the industry's changed, but clearly these guys haven't caught up yet, or vice versa. Maybe these guys are trying something new and it's not been seen before. So it's great to get your hands stuck in different projects in that way.
Oh, definitely. So in terms of like passive income streams, have you created apps for yourself that do that or other things that do that?
Yeah, so it's weird because I think generally it's led by most of my freelance work. So the active portion of it. I've worked on other apps in the past, whereby there could have been different payment strategies. Like, for example, not even the monetization, but just in the sense of you get paid maybe in shares to a company or looking at, those kind of options. Working on some of my own projects, you always get the case of balancing. You want to do your own work, but at the same time, maybe this once in a lifetime opportunity with a certain client comes along, you're like, okay, cool, park that for a bit, do this. So I've had that up and down for a while. I've got several projects in kind of anywhere ranging between 60 to like 90% complete. So I think with this downtime, it's been amazing to be able to kind of emphasize those a little bit more, getting to even more things a little bit outside that, like course creation, looking at not only seeking a mentor, but also maybe being a mentor. So that's also been an arena I've looked at. In the digital nomad space, I know they've got loads of other things like dropship that they throw out there a lot. There's having even creating products and then having that be your passive source of income. So I've dabbled in several of those. Some of them have come off really well, but I guess as of now, I think most of them are still secondary to freelance gigs because I think per unit time, they seem to win on that case. But I'm still working on building some of the others as well.
So do you feel like there's any kind of misconceptions about what being a digital nomad is? Because I know, like, to me, when I first heard the term, it seemed like if you weren't just solely maintaining a passive income stream of, drop shipping, or maybe you've got apps that are making you sales, or you're selling a product, and if you're actually doing work, that means, for the next 5 days I have to do work, then you're not a digital nomad. That doesn't count.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think over the years, the definition has been vague enough, I guess, as you say, to cause that confusion, whereby on one side you feel like, well, if I've only got one source, then am I a nomad, or is it just that I happen to own a job? Because I feel like that's kind of how I identified in the beginning. I felt like if I was, say, a freelancer, for example, you technically own a job. It's not a company that would, necessarily scale and then have 40 employees or whatever. You can outsource everything and delegate and all that, but it's definitely not the same. But I think in any capacity, even taking away the part of, I guess, the desire to travel, I think the definition really was the idea of whatever ecosystem you created, as long as you were there or thereabouts when it came to being location independent, then that would be ultimately what pushed you into the category of being either a nomad or not. Because I think with, for example, remote work, I think that was that still constituted being a digital nomad. Literally just changing your permanent role into more of a remote setting was enough to qualify at the time. I think nowadays it's been redefined in previous times, just because I think there are many more ways to do things passively than actively. But I think for the average, I think the average nomad friend I've got, most of the cases they've got one sole source of income that's their big portion of the pie, and then maybe smaller passive streams.
So in terms of finding work, being a digital nomad, location independent, remote, and that kind of thing, how difficult do you find it to find work compared to, because recruiters call all the time, right? And most of the time, I got a job in London, I got a job here, but it's rare that you get a call where they're like, yeah, we need an Android developer, we need an iOS developer, you can work wherever you want, just, we need you to start now. So how hard do you find that, or how easy do you find that to find that kind of work?
Yeah, I think I might have had a lot of practice. It may be my perm days. Yeah, I remember in the early phases, there was definitely a drop in, I guess, engagement when it came to how many recruiters would call you, especially once I'd made the official transition. All my public profiles were basically different. I think it's one of those things where that's kind of what forced me to kind of look more into the whole idea of the marketing aspect. Probably is something I should look further into. So I tried a few other options, and especially keeping myself very visible online on job boards, making posts that might, indicate to people that you're looking for a new challenge or you're looking to seek something different. And I will say, yeah, the engagement is definitely different in the freelance world, but I think it's that catch-22 of, I think, again, luckily I had some development experience, but if this was a new arena, I think the first question would be, you want a role, but then where do you get the experience to fulfill that first role? Because they always tend to need some experience. So I still felt exactly the same skill set was being reused from my perm days to my freelance when I first began. So I was already a developer with a few years under my belt anyway. It just felt like the only difference really was the business structure around what I did. The perks that I had as far as being more free to manage my own time were those were probably things that took a bit of getting used to. So the idea that, yeah, you might do your development day to day, but you still got extra activities to worry about, like, making sure that recruiters know you're available, or clients that you've worked with previously sort of know where you're going to be back on the market, so that if they've got something reoccurring. And I feel like that's kind of it's a carousel, but I guess in this one, it does move at your pace. So if you end up in a scenario where, because initially for me, I'd planned it out as far as having maybe 6 to 9 months of active work, and then with lower pressure of having just the other 3 months being fulfilled by passive work, it felt attainable. But then you get to a point sometimes where you might get comfortable because you've got a particular client or two that happen to be basically giving you most of, your income. So I think it was just that, the constant re-engaging and making sure that you don't sit too still for too long. You just definitely need to keep exercising the muscle. So I think in between projects, I got over the I chase them sort of thing. So I think by the time I transitioned over, I felt like the clients and projects were just coming to me because they felt like the match was just that good that we should have engaged. So I felt like that's what was happening. It was rare that I would actually go out and actively go on job boards and apply.
Yeah. It's kind of more just like you put a sign up like I'm available, and then people just...
Yeah, and if anything, they kind of gravitated to me. Yeah, precisely.
Just give me 1 sec. I think there's someone at the door, so...
No worries.
Sorry. Yeah, they don't appear to be there anymore. So this is the beauty of a podcast. You can do editing.
Yeah. And it's always the deliveries nowadays. I just don't understand. Like you're literally getting your stuff frisbeed at you, and then they just leave.
Yeah. Either it's being frisbeed at you, or there's other people's stuff being frisbeed at you. Like, can you just hold on to this for a minute?
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. Wicked.
All right, cool. So let's quickly jump into, because I'm super interested in where is it? The word is escaping me now. Ethnography. So go for it. What is it? And explain to me like that kind of stuff you've done with it. Because like I said, I've literally never heard the word before. And then I quickly Googled it, and it sounds super interesting, but I don't want to pretend like I know because I have no idea. So,
no worries.
You go for it.
Yeah. So I literally, the idea of it, or the premise of it, literally is, it leans more towards the social sciences. So the idea of it literally is that you're doing sort of like an interview or an observation into the cultural customs, behavioral patterns of said demographic in a particular content. So for me, I think the first instance I ever had of it was on my third year dissertation. So the idea was looking at how Android apps play, what part do they play, or what part do digital services play in the arena of going out nightlife. Like how would you use an app in nightlife to kind of maybe enhance the experience, or maybe make people feel more safe. So the idea was you would go out, I would interview people on campus, and I'd ask them basically to kind of poke and prod at problems that they might face. So it's basically like market research. It literally feels like market research, but in a more social science context. So you would ask some questions through either interview, you would look at case studies, you yourself maybe even would embed yourself in that environment so you can get as close as possible to the actual true experience of these individuals. I ended up doing that in one of my internships actually, which came off the back of that project. So I lived in with this one guy. I think we were doing digital service. We were looking into digital services around the home. So i.e. Facebook, BBC iPlayer, all these kind of services. And I would basically sit with this guy and just observe his moves. How long did he spend on particular services? Did he transition between different services? Why did he transition? And taking all that data, compiling it into a report that then helps then inform the design stage of a particular service. So it's almost like a backwards approach. So rather than me going, you know what, I like a certain SDK, let me try it out, create an app and hope that it takes to the market, you kind of reverse engineer it and decide to look at exactly what problems need to be solved, and then literally use those to define your use cases. And once your use cases are defined, you're now talking about wireframes and design, UX designs off the back of that. And then eventually you get coding, you write your tests, and then bang, you have an app. So from the start to end, the ethnographic portion really is the research and the formulating of that research in the way that makes sense to the designers so they can actually make use cases out of it, and the business analysts that can make use cases out of it. So it spans any context. As long as you have an aim, usually typically just to understand the problem domain. So you never go in thinking you're going to design something for it, but it's just to be as open-minded as possible and kind of just see where and when there's an opportunity for you to pretty much create something to solve that problem.
So how many places have you, or does this come anywhere into your freelance work, or have you worked with companies that make use of that?
Yeah, so I feel I think the most recent occurrence probably is, I mean, the closest thing to that I've seen, I would say, is probably the guys at Google. So they've got, I mean, Google's massive. They've got several different branches and different arenas that they work in. And I think one thing that lured me into this project particularly is because if I ever had a choice to work on a project, I think having my fair share of, the more commercial apps, ones that have tight deadlines and really strict release cycles, this one was all about, it almost removed the concept of time. They were looking at it more from a POC perspective. So proving any kind of concept is great because you remove a lot of those limitations of you need X number of working men, working hours, a team has to be of this size, et cetera, et cetera. You're pretty much left to really explore the art of development from a more creative lab aspect. So that's pretty much what they did. I think they run these experiments on and off. And the idea here was, as people, they continue to increase their screen time. it's a lot easier to now consider yourself where you can say, okay, I'm exhibiting symptoms of, social fatigue or whatever that is, social media fatigue, or just screen time fatigue in general. So what they wanted to do is they have noticed that in their particular application, there's not a great deal of notification management. So your notifications just come in, right? I mean, you're at the mercy of the vendor. If you download a certain app, they might go bonkers with the with the notifications. They can tell you everything that's happening in the app, and it might not be of any use to you. There's no real way to. It's kind of an on and off kind of switch with it.
Yes.
So what they did is they just started creating a bunch of launch screen apps that would help the user understand and manage at least in this case, the notification aspect of things. So I think the three that I worked on touched on it in different aspects, and they took different approaches. I remember, I think there was one called Desert Island, and as the name suggests, it literally was about the idea of being, so you've got an app, and then you basically, if I'm on a remote island, for example, there's only certain applications that I really care about at that moment. So I would, as soon as you install the app and you launch it, your home screen starts to walk you through a process of pretty much customizing it. So you put certain apps on that you would imagine to be using in a particular context. And then those would be prioritized when it comes to notifications, for example. So that was one angle that they took. I think the other one that was quite interesting for me was the idea of, I believe it was Morph. So this app was interesting because it brought in, again, a part of ethnography, which is context awareness, at least for the application's perspective. So the app should just know, based off your location, that, oh, you're in the gym. So now you're talking about using apps like Strava and your Step app rather than, and maybe your music player, and then maybe not your emails because you don't care about those at that moment, and vice versa. So like if I'm in home mode right now, it would be more anything that can let me relax and chill would be my initial emphasis. So it used that paradigm pretty much to navigate which apps to present you as the user. So that's kind of how that worked.
Okay, that's super interesting. So you brought it up. So I'm gonna see if I can dig a little bit deeper. So you're a freelancer, you're a digital nomad, and now you're freelancing at Google, right? This is a freelance.
Yes, so I did a couple months, literally short of a couple of months there, in the beginning of the year actually. So just before all the craziness ensued with the pandemic and everything, they had this requirement to kind of patch these apps up and actually just clean up some of the stuff that they were working on. Because essentially, if these experiments go to plan, what that typically means is now they've got something where they could actually potentially want to infuse deeper into the OS. So I thought that was a selling point for me. Being part of the experiment was one thing, but just to have something that kind of almost changes the narrative, as it's done in previous aspects. I mean, if we look at exactly what they've done with some of the newer design patterns and architectures, for example, I mean, people were doing their own bespoke versions of MVVM, and MVP before Google started implementing it and baking it into the OS. So I felt like even with this, which is something, again, just a small touch, but it's just the idea of having a notification management now be something that's at the heart or core of their OS. So that was kind of something that gravitated me towards that particular project. So I think I got a couple extensions, and then I quickly just decided to wrap it up, and just, especially I think in going into Feb/March, I think a lot of stuff was slowing down. We had the off payroll stuff going on. There was just a bunch of stuff going on this year. So I felt like it was great to just get that experience, finish up, and then just to see what's going to happen next, really. I think they're all on the App Store right now, and they're just looking at the data, looking at the use cases, seeing why and how people are gravitating and using them through analytics. And then that will be something that they can then use to inform version 2.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that they'll take an idea, bake it into an app, and then, if it ends up doing what they think it's going to do, it will be part of the OS, as opposed to just putting it in the OS and see if people want it or not. Because they've done stuff like that before where, you get the beta, and all the way up to release, there's this feature you really like, and then it comes out and they took it away because
You're like, where's it gone?
we don't know why. Is do people not want to use it? Was it not ready?
Yeah.
This is a really interesting way for them to go about it. So yeah, that's pretty cool that you got to work on that.
Yeah, and I think it was, I think it reminded me again as to what I liked about the non-technical aspects of the development process. Because I feel like as far as coming out of uni, I was under the impression that I could literally walk into a home of someone's or an office of someone's, conduct my study, get my results, go into design, develop, and then obviously release the app. But then finding out that you don't even need to do all of those things. There's so much work that they are their own roles. That was also a great degree of freedom and flexibility I had with freelance, because I could dabble into the idea of just the research and not even touch the code. Or in most cases, I would probably opt more for the physical nitty gritty and the development. But I felt it's made me a better developer, just by understanding the pipeline of work that's necessary to get me to the point where I'm placed with, anywhere between 10 to 50 wireframes and figuring out why they're designed the way they're designed.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a good way because you get to see the process before the work gets to you. So then you know what went in to get it to you, depending on which company you work on. Because I've worked on some companies where they definitely didn't go through that process. They just gave me work. They're like, hey, go build this. It's going to be $1 million idea. Yeah.
And I feel like I've dabbled with that in the past. And I think with the experience of I've always voiced my concern with that. But yeah, I guess as you said, it depends on the company you're in. The attitudes might not be the same.
They don't want to hear it. Some people don't want to hear it. At some point, you just give up the argument, don't you?
Exactly. So you always feel like, it's just, there's some points you're in a lucky enough space, you can offer that input and not even feel like you're going to be shut down. But most cases, you probably will. So I think that's kind of why I prefer, if there's ever a context where you've got a more creative lab kind of scenario, a POC type of atmosphere, I think it's so different compared to, say, a greenfield project where everything has pretty much been decided. All you need to do is slot in, do your bit, and kind of get out. So I've played with both, and I definitely prefer the former, if I'm honest.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I don't mind the greenfield. Really, it depends on the scenario. Like if I take a 3 month because I want some money to go traveling, I don't care. But if I want to commit time to it, and I'm giving you my opinion, and you guys are like, no, this is, we don't care, then that's probably not for me either.
100%. I think I experienced that as well. Thankfully, with one of the clients I had in the banking sector, they were number one, and they still are at the time. And they had this idea of going in with a pretty much fresh face. I mean, you are just adding yet another feature into the dozens that they've already got. But at least that particular feature, I guess on both instances, because I worked in two major parts of the application, they did take that approach of, so the research was already done. And as far as a developer, I guess you earned your spot on the team if you did speak out and you did voice any concerns. I mean, this is in addition to the idea of having other challenges that we haven't even got into, like time zone differences. If you work with a team offshore and they are 8 hours ahead of you, it's like so difficult to pretty much manage the workload. I mean, if you have a miscommunication and then they find out about it as they come in and you've just left, and then you've lost the whole day trying to undo some of that. So I think there were so many different things there, or managing a team that constantly shrinks and then grows again. There's loads of aspects of having a larger team, a dispersed team, everyone with different opinions, different views, cultural attitudes towards development. We somehow made it work, but it definitely wasn't easy.
I could imagine. I mean, I've done like remote probably the last few years have been remote. And I've only come across a couple of situations where time zones come into play. But really, it doesn't seem like it's a problem until something goes wrong. And then you get that scenario you mentioned where I don't know that went wrong until tomorrow, and they don't know it went wrong until the day after.
You're just like, wow.
It's just like days of time wasted.
Yeah, definitely.
So my next question, I think like we're getting close to wrapping this up. I've got a couple of like random quick fire questions. Maybe not so quick. You don't have to be quick, but we'll see how it goes.
Awesome.
So the first question is, why did you choose Android and not iOS?
Right. Yeah. So for me, I was, I think, a student around this time when I wanted to do my final year dissertation. this was the time of like, when the BlackBerry was out. You had people had the BlackBerry Curve and the Bold. There's like HTC ones.
It was like 2011, something like this, right?
Yeah, early parts of last decade. So I'm wrapping up. Like, I mean, as a student, I always felt like the money thing was tight. I was like, look, I sided with Android from the get go. iPhone was shiny, and I admired iOS aesthetics and just, I think their brand loyalty, even to this day, again, remarkable. And from a social science perspective, I was like, how do they get these people hooked? Like, because you would have people that would swear by Apple, swear by iOS.
They could sell you anything.
Couldn't tell you anything about the specs. So I felt like it was so interesting to see that be of not importance when it pertained to Apple. Now, if you put a Windows machine in front of them now, like that might change. They'd be questioning the RAM, the hard drive, and all sorts. So I felt like with phones, it was a similar thing. There was also a lot of competition, I think, amongst my friends. I mean, as I said, we had BlackBerry, we had HTC, we had the first couple of iPhone iterations. I mean, there was only a select few at the time that used to have those. People were still stuck on the physical button, so BlackBerry was taken over as well. So I just kind of, I mean, with the resources I had, I knew Java, knew XML, and owned an Android phone. I mean, the Android phone I owned at the time was literally one of the old school, low budget. I think it might have been the T-Mobile variant. It was very literally low budget. And I thought, okay, this is my toolkit. This is what I'm going to work with. I've seen iOS. I, at the time, didn't even really know any iOS developers because I think from a course perspective, my idea of, I was a computer science student anyway. I gathered in some capacity I was going to be a software developer. I had no idea about language, platforms, or any of that. I just knew if I wanted to make a mobile app, these were the resources I had to my disposal. This is how I was going to be an Android developer. And from there, I pretty much went on to make this really massive monolith of an app. It was literally an early version of WhatsApp, Uber, and Foursquare at the time, which was, I think, quite good, quite hot at the time. So it was around the idea of nightlife, and you would basically go out in the context of the night, and then you're going to network with your friends beforehand. So you need some kind of event generation, then message each other. On the night out, you need to know roughly where each other was from a location perspective. And there was all these aspects to it. And then there was trying to book cabs, all in one app, but mind you. So I mean, nowadays we know that is definitely not the way to go. I mean, that's four big apps right there. So I felt like that was something that I and I think the access to it, not from an accessibility as far as UX, but just the idea that I could literally get, I think it was Eclipse at the time we used. So you get Eclipse, download this SDK, and you're off. Whereas from what I remember, Apple was a little bit more reserved and restricted in that aspect. You definitely had to pay like $99 or whatever it was
for the license. Yeah,
and I wasn't even sure if it was per year or one-off. I don't remember.
Still don't know.
I just remember it. Yeah.
I think it's a rolling thing, but I have no idea.
Yeah, I remember that being one of the caveats. Xcode, again, I was on a Windows machine at the time as well. So there were so many restrictions. I literally, as far as computer science as a whole, so everything from data structures all the way till I think some of the C++ stuff I did, I attribute that to the course itself. Everything else was pretty much self-taught as far as Android. We had literally one module that was covering Android. But as you probably are aware, at the time, the life cycle was so short. You're talking about gingerbread, but these guys already got ice cream sandwich out and honeycomb. So already being behind the curve in that sense, I think I remember just taking a bunch of time to hit YouTube and just literally teach myself everything I knew at the time. I think Coursera and Udemy and all these other platforms were just in their infant stage. There was not a lot if you wanted to be an Android developer. Maybe marketing, graphic design, plethora of, maybe photography, but development specific, not much until recent. So it's all just been self-taught and just making sure that you understand that there is no point in time where you'll know everything there is to know about the platform. It just changes too frequently.
Even technologies and stuff.
Yeah, in general.
The way that I approach it is, if I go for an interview or if somebody asks me, do I know something? It's like, no, but I can find out. Because there's no way that you know everything. You know what you've done, and then really there's no point learning other things until you get there because you don't know if you're going to need it. And by the time you
Precisely.
actually do need it, there's probably something else.
The platform is way too big for me to just casually be like, you know what, this API sounds good. Let me just dabble with this one as well, and that one, and that one. I've definitely been strategic in that aspect. I would pick stuff that was definitely going to be attractive to the end clients I imagine myself working with. So I think with, in particular, I think I was very well engrossed in the media space and streaming and video on demand. I think even in those early phases, Apple pretty much had it together with, I think they had HLS at the time. Android was struggling. It was like behind every step of the way. So there was a large R&D component of my career where I just spent a good year or so figuring out what video platforms were available on Android. How do you stream? What's a transcoder? What's the watermarking aspect? How do these files actually work at a granular level? And then from there, it made it easy to just branch out into stuff that was also applicable. I mean, I would think I was working on that just before the bring your own device revolution. So now everyone's got their own phone. You deliver the video in a completely different manner than we would have done on, say, some of my other clients' applications.
Yes, yeah, that's super interesting. I've only recently started looking at media player stuff just for fun. And I would have thought by now it was so much more mature that you could just, jump into a tutorial and get through it. And it's still like you can jump into a tutorial and get through it, but then when you get to the end, it still doesn't work and you still have to figure out the rest. So,
yeah. Then there's all the politics around, DRM and copyright management.
Yeah.
Unless you're leveraging somebody else's APIs, there's not a great deal that you could basically get away with.
So next question. See, as I said, quickfire questions, but I think I ask them quickfire, but I want like a long form answer. So
yeah.
So the next question is, do you have any tools, tips or tricks that you think other app developers should know about, but they might not?
Yeah. This actually touches on your previous point about getting into a scenario where you would only dabble with an SDK.
Yeah.
Unless you would only dabble with an SDK if and when you needed one. So I would say, I think one thing that I've done that's helped me is if, as I said, looking at the clients that I want to work with, I kind of try and envisage what it is they would potentially be using. And if I can't get experience on that, then I would create my own experience just by using the SDK, creating a sample app, and then displaying that I have interfaced with this before. So it's not going to be foreign to me. I think the second quick tip I would probably say is maybe, I think going through a lot of courses, I've also noticed as well that there's so much, as Android matures, I've noticed that there is actually a direct correlation with the amount of boilerplate you end up having to write. So I think I found out recently about live templates and the idea of just you pretty much create a shortcut that would kind of allow you to create stuff, especially particular functions that you would write over and over and over again. I can make a simple shortcut like maybe PSTF, and then that would literally be public static void main. If I was in the Java world, for example, you could do the same for maybe if you're writing, recycler views, or if you're writing, network library type stuff as well, where it's all the same type of code that only has very slight nuances from a project to project. So I think doing that saves a lot of time. So any time saving aspect, I would say, live templates is a great one for saving time. You literally predefine your shortcut ahead of time. It means something to you. As soon as you type those letters out, the IDE knows, okay, boom, I need to just insert this whole function in. So it's pretty much like autocomplete, but on steads. Just so I find that really useful.
So a fun one is, what machine do you use to work with?
So as I mentioned earlier, I was of the Windows family back in the day. Those days are way behind me now. The number of MacBooks I've gotten through over the years. Right now, I'm using one of the. So there was a point in time, I think, where they had an issue with some of the status bars, right? So once they revised that and done a bunch of silent upgrades, I was like, I think it's time. So I got one early last year. But prior to that, I'd also had a MacBook, but it was a 13-inch MacBook. And I think the higher emphasis was on being mobile and be able to travel with it. But I've gotten so good at packing right now, it's like I can get everything in one suitcase, no matter where I'm going. So now having a 15-inch machine with a bit more power definitely helps get things done.
They're really good for battery life if you're traveling as well, right?
Yeah, really good.
My last touch at Windows machines was at least running Windows on a machine, was the battery life was not good.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's weird as well because Windows has this thing where anything, it's weird that it's tied to price point, but anything in that 500 mark that is just about cutting it only works well if you're literally doing nothing other than office work and light intense. As soon as you're talking about development, all of a sudden you have to start thinking about having twice as much RAM as everyone else, like, and having, you know, a crazy amount of storage. So for me, I think that was the case with this. Like, I didn't fully customize it, but I definitely made sure that, knowing about Moore's law and all that, I wouldn't opt for, say, an 8 gigabyte machine in this climate, knowing that I want it to last, you know, at least 5 years. So you start thinking about, you know, 16 gig. It comes at a steep price, but I feel like it then pays for itself as the years progress, as long as you look after it.
Yeah, and it saves you money going forward, right? Because if it's going to last for 5 years now, as opposed to 2, you don't have to shell out all that money in 2 years' time for a new one.
Precisely, and I feel like that's a really strange thing that I notice in a lot of projects and a lot of companies as well. I mean, thankfully, I've had the benefit of both. I've used company-specific machines. I've used my own machines. What's always interesting is how these companies manage to literally grind perfectly working machines to a halt. Because I think the custom OS, and having experience with that, I just thought, yeah, this is so strange that at the mercy of security, unfortunately, performance sometimes suffer. And it's like, you know, you get one, I guess the only saving grace with that is you're always of the understanding that at least if there is a technical problem, it's usually their problem, because it's probably something that's wrong with their device. I've had instances where you're trying to debug your own machine, but because it's your machine, it's your issue. So it's an interesting one.
And it's hard to tell the end client, like, oh, I wasted a day because my machine was just not working.
Yeah.
So like we're not paying you for that.
I think I should write an intro on like onboarding, because I've done it so many times. I feel like it's not a thing anymore. Being the new guy in the office doesn't really faze me anymore. And just the onboarding process, so many uniform similarities, but there's also key distinctions. I feel like for example, with Google, I literally brought my own machine. So, I mean, there was no setup, but there's companies where you get like 2-3 days of onboarding, or then maybe you got to wait for like a week to be approved. Someone's literally just going to press a button to say,
just waiting for accounts to be set up. You're like, I could have done, you could have done this when I wasn't here. And then I could just
approve
start.
your permissions. It's a bit nuts, but yeah, I think all of that stuff around development, again, maybe creates material for a whole other podcast in itself. It's so interesting to kind of get an insight into all those challenges, in addition to just your everyday, like day-to-day problem solving as a developer.
Especially if you're new to going into it, you assume I'm just going to go in, they're going to give me something to write, and I go write it. And then, like you said, you might be waiting 5 days before you can actually do anything. And then you get into that awkward situation where it's like, well, I have to pretend like I'm doing something, but I have nothing that I can do. That's always a fun
crazy.
one.
I've had clients that you're not getting started for maybe 6 weeks. So you're just chilling. You're supposed to spend that time kind of understanding the source code, understanding the problem domain, but then because you're not set up, you don't have the relevant access. And then it's like, okay, so what do I do now? Like, I need to be useful. I need to be productive. I need to create some use case for why the hell they hired me. So I mean, there's loads of issues with that. I think I found that I think people were more forgiving in my perm days when that happened, because I know there was obviously an instance where the onboarding is going to take forever. I think when you're a freelancer, there's such a high expectation, or just an external resource in general. There's a high expectation to just hit the ground running, be familiar with the unfamiliar. You're going to be thrown in at a code base that you might think should be way better than in the condition it actually is in.
Which is like 99% of the time.
Yeah.
Like, how many code bases have you been into and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing? That never happens.
It seldom happens, unless it's a sample app that's literally no more than 100 lines.
Oh yeah, then you can't mess that up.
Yeah. After that, it's like scalability becomes an issue. It's like, now we'll think about refactoring at a later date. So at this point, we're talking about version 9, and we're still, we've got legacy code in there that we shouldn't have. I think that's probably one of the biggest problems I've seen as well, because Android doesn't seem to be getting any smaller as a platform. And I think the overhead now for developers to now have to maintain knowledge of 2 main object-oriented programming languages is just, it's beyond me. Like, I used to see it with Swift and iOS and think, yeah, you guys are suffering. But then Kotlin got adopted, and I was like, oh man. But thankfully, Kotlin's amazing. But just the idea of having to still look at a class, sometimes go in for a client and then go, wait, I know full well that I should be rewriting this in Kotlin, but that poses its own challenges if, say, testing is not up to scratch. So you kind of just work around the creaks in their application and just hope that it doesn't just come toppling over. So I think that's a very big challenge. Hopefully, we would have phased out some of the older languages and older design paradigms in favor of new stuff. But because things keep changing, no one's ever all on the same playing field.
No, there's always more that you need to know. And then things like this, you think you're really good at Android, Java, and then Kotlin comes in and there's some new kid who suddenly knows everything about Kotlin and you have no idea what he's talking about or shape because now they're ahead of you, even though you're like, hold on a minute, I've got 6 years behind me.
Yeah, precisely. I think that reset button was definitely shaky. It felt shaky, especially for my career, because I felt anything I had to know about Kotlin at the time, again, the same catch-22 of needing the experience beforehand, but not really having an opportunity to get the experience. You just had to create an app that would allow you to play with it and get familiar with it enough for you to then be able to claim that, okay, look, I can still do this, and this. I understand the fundamentals of X, Y, Z. I think it happened with a lot of libraries as well. And I guess that is something that is a side effect of sometimes being on, not necessarily with one client, but on one project for an extended period of time. It's nice to almost have it as your baby and kind of nurture it and then see it grow and blossom, but then at the expense sometimes of not keeping up to date with what the new stuff is. So I think it's just it's a balance of teaching yourself outside of the confines of, say, whatever project you happen to be working on at that moment.
So what do you think separates a okay developer from a great developer?
Right. So I think over the years with interviews, understanding everything from onboarding, you're still running a business, and all that other stuff, I feel like maybe it's the emphasis on maybe more soft skills and just the idea that the soft is just, if not more important than the hard skills, because I think you get a lot of, I guess maybe more, this might even be more of a misconception and a stereotype on the industry as a whole, but you get a lot of people's idea of a developer as being someone very introverted, very much to themselves. Remote working out of a cupboard in the middle of nowhere would be an ideal location. Away from as many people as possible, to themselves, let them get on with it. But I felt that already boxes you into a certain type of role. And I think over the years, I think if you're going to be anywhere maybe similar, analogous to, say, Google or anywhere where they've got more of a people-facing, client-facing attitude, I think that's something that you just have to come to grips with. I mean, for me personally, I am quite the ambivert. I'm not super extroverted, but I'm not on the other end of the spectrum either. So I think over time, I've just developed this idea of being able to just understand that technical skill is definitely important, but also know that the soft skills are just as important. And of course, most cases, it will be some sort of team dynamic. So you need to kind of understand the higher level pain points and design decisions and not let that almost come in conflict with your ego and feel like, okay, I know this design pattern should be done like this, but they've put this button here. Why? So I think, understanding the why will probably be, for me, it's definitely helped with communication and rapport between me and other developers or any team member for that matter. It helps me kind of remove most of what would have been conflict and just sort of reach a common understanding from the jump. And then you just realize, okay, that needs to be done that way because that designer has understood from whatever research they've done that that's how it's meant to be architected, versus almost like bending the app around what my current level of expertise is at the time. So for example, I think you might have instances where, you might only know a said few methods of concurrency, for example. You've got an app that clearly needs more of a coroutine approach, and you're still stuck maybe on, say, async tasks or loaders going, this is the only thing I know right now, so this is how we're going to make this work. So I feel like, stuff like that's definitely a great thing. Maybe not refactoring too soon and kind of not resisting the urge to fight iteration. So you have to write that terrible line of code or that terrible module or that terrible function first, and always go back and revisit it. As long as you've got the chance and the creative capacity to be allowed to do so within that project, that's going to help. I mean, sometimes you might be on a project with a really tight deadline and it's not so easy, but it being that you're satisfying an end client, you've got both things to consider as well. It needs to be to your standard of whatever perfection is, but it also needs to be done in a way that doesn't block development or you don't become a bottleneck. So yeah, it's a trade-off. And I guess I think the one last thing I would say is probably remaining a student of the game. As I said before, you just will not know everything. I mean, there's a new framework released every week. So it's impossible to keep on top of it and just be in the know of every single thing. I think, yeah, it's just practice and mastering the craft. And the only way you're going to do that is just to continuously do it, whether you're being paid or not. Just find a way to continuously practice your craft. And that's the only way you can kind of stay, not even necessarily on top, but at least just in the conversation so that you've got more options to navigate.
Yeah, you definitely want to stay in the conversation. I would agree with everything you said in the answer. Cool. So that's everything from me. Do you have any projects or anywhere that you want me to point people to where they could find you, Twitter or Instagram or GitHub or whatever?
I guess working on my website actually now, like just refining it and adding some more content that I want to create on that. And yeah, having maybe a look at my GitHub. That's Michael Yao. So I think I could probably send you the link.
I'll stick in the show notes, so it's all good, yeah.
Wicked, yeah. So that's pretty much it, yeah. Instagram, LinkedIn, GitHub. Those are probably the main ways to find me. Of course, you can hit my website, send me an email, and I'll just be answering queries as well.
Big thank you to today's guest, Mike Akakpo. You can find Mike on LinkedIn, on his website, nomadic.co.uk with a Q, or on Instagram at IamMikeYao. As always, you'll find the show notes as well as links to everything we talked about in today's episode at robj.me/coffeeandcoding. If you like the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Personally, I use Pocket Casts, so shout out to them. And if you really like the show, please do leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the show just like an app. The higher the rating, the more visible it becomes. And it makes us feel good. Finally, if you'd like to follow me online, you can find me everywhere at lowcarbrob, or you can find me online at robj.me. And that's all from me. Thanks for listening, and I hope to catch you next week on the Coffee and Coding podcast.